John Metcalf has been one of the leading editors in Canada for more than 5 decades, editing more than 200 books over this time, including 18 volumes of the best Canadian stories anthology. He's also the author of more than a dozen works of fiction and non-fiction, including Finding Again the World, Selected Stories, and An Aesthetic Underground, a literary memoir. He's senior fiction editor at Biblioasis and lives in Ottawa with his wife, Myrna, who's sitting in the other room. Working hard? Yeah. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you.
You've not just, how long has Temerity and Gall been out?
6 months or so, yeah.
And you have the Temerity and Gall as an immigrant to pass judgment on Canadian literature.
I called the book Temerity and Gall because W.P. Kinsella wrote a letter about me to the Globe and Mail that was published that said that John Metcalf, an immigrant, has the temerity to criticize Canadian writing, and in the most galling manner, I think he said,
right.
to tell Canadians about their own literature. I was so amused by this letter, and particularly the an immigrant part, because it revealed something that I've been writing about, of course, for years, that puts Kinsella, who's really an appalling writer, into the extreme nationalist class. A writer very much in the tradition of being ultra-nationalist in his views and defensive about Canadian books and everything. And I've always been rather irritated with Leon Rook, who's a very close friend of mine, who actually taught Kinsella in a writing class. I think it was in Victoria many years ago, and I wish he'd flunked him out. Anyway, so it goes.
Okay, so let's look at that immigrant
label.
Label is good, yes. You grew up in Bristol?
No, my father was a Methodist minister, and under the rules and regulations of the Methodist Church, had to move his ministry every 5 years to a new church in a different area. So I was born in Cumberland, actually, in Carlisle. Spent my first years in Keighley in Yorkshire, and then moved down to Bournemouth in Hampshire, and then to Beckenham, part of Greater London. When I left home, when I was 17 or 18, I went to Bristol University, and from there emigrated to Canada.
Okay, that's the connection. So how are you like your father and unlike your father?
Well, that's a very interesting question. He was really a rather remote man. I couldn't really, he was always a figure that was sort of, even within the household, was removed from everyone else. I have no idea of the nature of his relationship with my mother, but for my brother and I, my brother's was 5 years older than me. I don't think we had any real relationship with my father at all. He rarely spoke to us. And he was a figure who exerted considerable and almost comic authority within the house. For example, if we were at the dinner table, and my brother and I would get into an argument about something, my father would sit there and he would be gazing off into space and everything. And if the noise level rose to a point that irritated him, he did this. And we immediately fell silent, because that was the signal that...
Otherwise what?
We never found out.
So he didn't beat you or anything?
No. that would have required more involvement.
Oh my
No,
goodness.
he just silenced us with his disapproval, and heralded by this little cough. That's it, boys, shut up. So yeah, he was a figure of tremendous authority in the house, really, and a certain remoteness towards us. Although the interesting thing was that after he died, various people in the congregation of the church where he had been last working said to me, how kind he was and how gentle he was when he went to hospitals visiting members of the congregation who were in hospital or ill, in various ways. And they spoke about, the depth of his pastoral care, which contrasted astonishingly to me with my own experience of him. But he was a very interesting person.
Yeah, I guess you may have thought, how come he's so nice to them and he's not nice to me?
Well, that was what I was struck by, by these comments about his kindness and his gentleness and his, involvement in other people's lives and that kind of thing. But, he came from quite strong Wesleyan background. I mean, he'd grown up on a farm in Cumberland. So his background wasn't a hugely educated or sophisticated one. Yet, when he died, I went back to England, of course, and I was looking along the books in his study, and I saw that book De Profundis by Oscar Wilde, and I'd seen it earlier when I was a teenager, and I thought it was a work of theology, and so I took it out and looked at it and realised, of course, what it was. And there were other strange things in his bookcase too, like, poets of the period like John Masefield collected poetry and things like this, and I thought this does not lock together with the man that I knew. And, so that was a fascinating thing to me. And I'm quite sure that, he never spoke about such things with my mother.
So it sounds like a bit of an enigma.
Yeah, so he was a strange person, I think. Yeah. And in many ways, I think very, very much not connected with the world. He was an unworldly sort of person, and which used to embarrass me when I was a boy. When I was growing up. He volunteered, most unusually, I don't know why, but he volunteered to take me to the cinema once. And cinemas in England at that time, the seats were divided, from the nearness or distance from the screen with different prices.
Oh, yes.
So, the cheapest seats would be a shilling or whatever it was near the front where you nearly broke your neck looking up at the screen. And at the back of the ground floor, of the cinema, the seats cost 2 and 6, because you had a really good view of the screen there, and et cetera, et cetera. And I even forget what the film was. But what I remembered, what filled me with horror was he inquired at the pay office, where you went in, how much the seats cost, and they said, 6pence, 9pence, and 2 and 6 or something, whatever it was, I don't remember. And he said, "Oh well, we'll have 2 of the 6penny ones." And then we went in, and he looked at the screen, and in the semi-dark this was, of course. And he says, "Well, we'll sit here." He said, "These look more comfortable." So we sat in the 2 and 6penny seats, you see, and a girl came round and said, "Can I see your tickets?" And he fumbles around and passes them to her, and she said, "Oh, these, you're in the wrong seats, you'll have to move." And my father said, No, these are quite comfortable, thank you. And resumed his gaze, into space and everything. And I was, of course, overcome with, destroyed with embarrassment. And, which again, I suppose is an anecdote about how disconnected he was from the world, and and really lived within, well, something that I could scarcely imagine. I don't know if I thought of it in those terms at that age. I just knew it really wasn't safe to go with him anywhere socially, as it were.
Without extreme embarrassment.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you get your love of the King James Bible from him?
Well, I mean, readings from it in church, of course, and Sunday school and things like that. I mean, it was very, very much more evident. I mean, obviously within the Anglican Church, and I mean the Methodist Church, by the time that I'm talking about here, had lost, or largely lost, its sort of working class enthusiastic quality, and had settled down and was very close to Anglicanism anyway. Mm-hmm. So the readings from the Bible would have been, from the authorized version. And no, I just, as a child, sitting, hearing this language rolling out, I mean, you knew that you were connected with something pretty serious and important. And of course, it was read by distinguished grown-ups speaking from behind a huge brass eagle lectern, and with the sun glinting on it and the sonorous verses rolling out. And yeah, they're quite wonderful.
What about your mum? Did you? I don't want to get too Freudian here, but I'll let the listeners do all that. But what about your mum? Like, did you at least have a connection of sorts with her? Or?
Oh, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, no, she was a very strong person, in not an intellectual person in any sense, but I mean, she was on my case, like from beginning to end. I mean, as a child, I was fairly unmanageable, and it was she who taught me how to read time, tell time on a clock or a watch. It took her about a year, and I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand what people were talking about. And, and she grilled me in math and spelling and, this kind of thing, all supplementary, of course, to school, which I largely ignored as much as possible. And really, I suppose in one way sort of saved my life, really. I mean, because otherwise I'd have just been like wild, and right. Stupid.
So you got a degree in English literature?
Yes.
And then you moved to Canada?
Yeah. Well, I taught in England for a couple of years, yeah.
And then to Montreal, where you were an English teacher.
Yeah.
And you started to, and I think the way you put it is, it had all started with putting together texts, so I'd have books to teach from that didn't involve Bliss Carman, Stephen Leacock, or Hugh McLennan.
Yes.
How did that transpire then? You started putting together anthologies for your students to read? No. That was the aim. After a couple of years, I realized that, Two Solitudes and The Red Pony by John Steinbeck, which were two of the books at the school I worked in, had multiple copies of, and I could see that, if I stayed on there teaching, I would have to teach these damn things forever. And I'd also realized that no Canadian books or anything were being taught at all, and they were not available. And, and I thought, well, I thought it was peculiar that Canadian writing wasn't taught in Canadian schools. It just seemed a bizarre thing to me. So I put together a book called 16 by 12, which was a book of short stories by Canadian writers with little photos of them in and commentaries and, things like this, and some stories that were suitable for, young readers. What do you mean put together? Did you approach, who did you approach?
Well, I approached all the individual writers and...
What about the publisher?
Ryerson at the time.
Okay.
Still going. Yeah.
It wasn't Lauren Pierce, though. It was, he died in 60, I think.
Yeah. No. But it was, I mean, it was still a going concern as an independent publisher then. It became McGraw-Hill Ryerson some years later. And I got to know editorial people there.
You were flabbergasted that they weren't teaching their own literature. Is that how it worked? And then you decided, I need to...
Yeah, well, I mean, I was not trying to do anything of a salvational nature. It was to prevent myself from going crazy, you know. And
yes, with boredom.
With boredom, yeah. And also, I mean, the people that I was teaching with were pretty ropey. You know, there was an anthology of short stories that I don't think had anything Canadian in them. It might have had Hugh Garner in or something like that, you know. But, I mean, there was nothing sophisticated in there whatsoever. I can remember there was a Hemingway story in this anthology. I think it was After the Storm. And I can remember to this day like a staff meeting of the English department where they were talking about this anthology and they were saying, what does this story mean? You know, what's his point? You know, what's the moral of the story? And, you know, it was... And I wrote somewhere rudely, you know, that it was like frustrated, angry chimpanzees trying to get a peanut out of a medicine bottle, you know. That they were, well, illiterate is the only, you know, thing that one could say about them. You know, and I remember a female teacher very high up in the English department, and I was, of course, very lowly being a newcomer, who wrote poetry. And she had a chapbook of her poems published, and one of them, a poem, an anti-alcohol poem. And I always remember the last stanza of it began, "For ways we have against this brute, if offered sherry, say, make mine fruit." And I thought that this.
It stayed with you, though.
Oh, unforgettable. Yes. This sort of symbolized how awful the environment of the school was, you know, in intellectual terms. It was just rigidly hopeless. So I'd become interested in publishing, you know, for various reasons. And, you know, and then in the way that things do happen in life, you know, somebody that I'd known for editorial reasons at Ryerson had left to go to some other publishing house, and he got in touch with me and said, "Do you want a job writing some introductions to these school texts?" And this went on and on and on, and you know, and gradually I sort of started to write or organize the writing of various books. And the head of the sort of English studies program of the whole Protestant School Board of Greater Montreal came into my classroom at the end of a day, and he sat down on the desk and he said to me, "I think you're the most interesting young writer young teacher in the system." And he said, I've got a contract to do 4 books with J.M. Dent, educational publishers at the time in Canada. And part of the Dent empire from England.
Yes, that would be Hugh Dent.
I don't know the boss man. I only dealt at lower levels, but he and I worked together and did 4 or 5 of these books that were called Wordcraft, which were like exercises in vocabulary and word meanings and all this kind of stuff. And you know, gradually, as these things went on, and you know, I wrote introductions to God knows what, you know, novels and things that were being taught, and at the time, of course, there was a sort of a bureaucratic system in Ontario where certain books were on an approved list that applied to the whole of the province of Ontario. And schools could buy those in bulk, but they could not buy any title that wasn't on that list. So it was like a approved material for the whole educational system of Ontario. And if you got a book onto that list, the money rolled in, because if the teachers heard of it and then they said, but can we get it? And they look up, yes. So they, so these vocabulary books, which were, not a great deal of work, but I mean, you had to apply yourself and churn them out. I was also amused one day when Caroline Addison, who's one of the most brilliant of the short story writers in Canada, said to me that she had one of these books in high school.
The wheel turns. So why the short story then? Speaking of which, why did you turn yourself to the short story?
Well, it simply struck me that of all the forms, it was the one that interested me most personally, because it was the most sophisticated kind of writing that I was aware of. That when it was being done brilliantly, Catherine Mansfield, James Joyce, Dubliners, stuff like this, that you're dealing and Hemingway, of course, the first book of stories, you're dealing in prose with structures that are essentially poetic. I mean, most prose struck me as, you settled down and you plowed through pages of it and you found out who did what and what was going to happen next, which seemed to me like, interesting enough, but nothing like the excitement of like being plugged into a mind like Catherine Mansfield's or, Hemingway's In Our Time or something like that. You read, I still read to this day. In fact, I'm going to be writing about it again fairly soon. Those early little interparagraph pieces that Hemingway wrote in Our Time, the refugees, the Christian refugees leaving Turkey, and the long line of the expelled, and the execution of the cabinet ministers shot against the wall of the hospital, and those things. Just 6, 7, 8, 10 lines, whatever it is. Those struck me as so exciting and so interesting, and and earlier than this, I'd been reading, with very little comprehension, but considerable excitement because of the noise of it, Ezra Pound. And I've been reading, the very early poems of D.H. Lawrence, which were also imagistic. This was when I was in Canada, not in England.
No.
I achieved an honours degree in English without having read or having anybody mention a short story in England. And we were told, in fact, that the syllabus really stopped at 1900 because anything past then, it was what you read for pleasure and, was not really teachable. So by the time I left, I had done 3 intense years of learning Anglo-Saxon vocabulary and etc., and could translate the bloody stuff. To this day, I couldn't remember a single word of Anglo-Saxon. I think it was just an exercise in discipline, basically, because otherwise it was just reading nice things, and that really wasn't suitable for a university. So they decided to make it very difficult by chucking in learning a new language, and translating, and etc. But I'd been reading some of the early Lawrence, which is intensely moving, and basically imagistic, in structure and all that kind of thing. And
in fact, you say about Imagism that your whole career is really a
conversation
with it.
I still is.
What is Imagism in a nice little nutshell?
Well, I mean, it was what Pound really sort of invented the word, the word and the idea and everything, and. He said to, what's her name?
HD?
Yeah, he said to HD in London when she'd been writing some of these Greek-influenced poems. He said, you are an imagist. Because her poems were just images. So imagism, according to Pound, was, the natural object is the symbol, is the meaning. And you
don't need anything more than that.
You don't need anything more. You don't need any clarifications, explication or anything. All you need is the picture, the image. And I mean, that's the essence of it. And also, it was, he said that, in poetry, he was talking essentially about poetry. He said, that the rhythm of poetry should not be of fixed meter, and like a what do you call it, on top of a piano that's clicking away,
metronome.
He said the rhythm of poetry should be the rhythm of breath, of breathing. So this is all very, very simple. But of course, when he postulated all this and wrote it down and everything, it was revolutionary at the time. He said it at a time when English prose was at its depth of awfulness, in sort of Edwardian, flowery, nonsense that's really unreadable today. And he cut through all the nonsense and stripped everything down to the bare essentials again, so that you were left with these images. I mean, Hemingway was involved in this whole situation far more than people thought. In fact, in 1923, Hemingway had gone to see Pound in Rapport, where he was living then, and he met there E.J. O'Brien, who was beginning to edit the best American short stories. So O'Brien says to Hemingway, have you got any stories? And Hemingway apparently had a manuscript with him of the short story My Old Man, and he gave it to O'Brien. Now, O'Brien's policy was that he only republished things that had already appeared in a magazine. But by the time the magazine came out...
Was that Scribner's?
No, it was 3 stories and 10 poems. It was published in, there's a little pamphlet-y thing that was published in 24, I think, in Paris. So O'Brien published it in the best short stories of 1923, and he dedicated the volume to Hemingway. But he spelled Hemingway wrong. And, nobody would believe that Ernest Hemingway was this other Ernest Hemingway, as he spelled it, leading to much pain and distress. But, Hemingway said later, I can't remember where he said it, but I have the reference somewhere written down, that the Pound taught him more about writing than anyone else ever did. And Pound, of course, was much taken with Hemingway's stripped down writing and according to Hemingway, showed him how to strip it down much more. And Pound is so interesting. I was reading something the other day actually about the fact that T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which was then called He Do the Police in Different Voices, Pound took it. It was 19 pages and cut it to 6. Which is the poem that we have now.
There was one that came out...
One a few years back, and now a new book's just come out
because it's
showing
the hundreds,
exactly
right?
What Pound did and saying how brilliant as an editor he was. And then there's H.D.'s Greek, in inverted commas, Greek poems that had that imagistic quality of just these strange pictures of, lacking entirely context or any conclusions or drawable morals or anything else. They just dare on the page. And of course, these are very like Pound's translations of the Chinese poetry, which are the same kind of things. And some of the most powerful, Pound did in a very early volume of these Chinese poems called Cathay, a very rare book. the difficulty of this kind of writing, it's essentially there in short stories. And, Hemingway did it, Pound did it, the Imagists did it, which was to place upon the reader the total responsibility for understanding what is being done. Northrop Frye wrote very, very cleverly, I thought. He said that modernism, because that's basically what we're talking about here, it didn't arrive in Canada until, like 100 years after it had been going on everywhere else in the world. Frye wrote that modernism was an embattled position whose purpose was to engage the reader. And he said that what the modernist work does is that the author throws the ball and it is entirely up to the reader to catch it. Yeah. Well, of course, what happened was that, only a few people were capable of catching it. And the same is true today.
Well, let's look at that then. Could we say that describes your taste?
Taste?
Sensibility?
Sensibility would be more like it. I sort of hammer away in everything that I write on a critical level of saying, you must learn to become a good reader. And, reading people like, shall we say in Canadian terms, Louise Penny is not going to teach you how to read. And you've got to submit yourself to the work, and you've got to learn what it is that has been going on for the last 100 years, and how many more years are we going to have to teach people how to read. But the battle still goes on.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, it's because it's the starting place, really. It's like, I don't know how to say this. It's so simple, yet not simple. The essence of what's going on in modernism is, say, film. Now, if you go back to the earliest of films, you'd see things like, silent films we're talking about, very, very early things. You'd have things like, there's a chap, and he goes to a house and he knocks on the door and a maid comes and she opens the door and the camera follows him and he goes into the living room and this lady gets up and he sort of has his straw hat clasped to his bosom and he bows and kisses her hand and they talk about something, there are subtitles on the screen, and then he leaves and the maid opens the front door for him and you see him going down the front steps and on onto the street. So that, I always say to people, that is what traditional writing does. This is what 90% or more of the world's fiction does. Whereas within a very short space of time, the people who made pictures realized we don't have to do all that crap. We could just go cut, and it moves from the drawing room to the street. And we have to supply.
We fill in the gap.
He has now gone out through the hall and down the front steps, and now he's in the street. Nothing difficult to understand in that. And, and then they did... The vocabulary of cinema did fade outs, close-ups, middle shots, distant shots. They did all kinds of... They invented a new grammar. And that grammar had been invented, almost at the same time as the language of film developed. So, they were basically aspects of the same thing. Did you know that I think it was in 1903 or something like that, or 1904, something like that, that James Joyce opened 2 cinemas in Dublin.
I think I read it in the book.
Yeah,
yes.
It's astonishing. People don't seem to make the connection. They don't sort of say, Ulysses.
I understand that, but how does that teach me to read then?
Well, because it teaches you the lesson that you move from picture to picture to to picture. And you stop thinking, well, I don't understand that, because here he was in the sitting room with this lady, but now he seems to be crossing a street. What's going on? So what's demanded of the reader by modernist writing, or any decent writing these days, is that the reader has to develop the ability to fill in the blank spaces. Which means that the reader has to fill the empty spaces with his or her own emotional grasp of what's going on. They have to make the story for themselves.
And sometimes the gap might just be a little bit too big.
It might be, yeah. But in that case, possibly the fiction has failed. That's entirely possible. I think it applies to quite a lot of poetry, for example. But really, it's a very simple thing.
The sort of the modernist movement. This is how you define what's good. Yes? And what I'm trying to get to is this on page 11. I've always assumed that the central task of a literary editor is recognizing, and the key word is recognizing, and helping along with sympathetic criticism, unknown and little-known writers.
Yes.
So what do you recognize?
I recognize the power and the immediacy of image, of writing, of the emotional tension that they can create, and the lack in their sentences of sloppy, repetitive nonsense.
Okay, and so your sympathetic criticism is getting rid of that sloppiness.
Yeah, or there won't be a lot of the sloppiness, otherwise I wouldn't be recognizing it, I would be dismissing it.
Right.
And I do, as an editor, I see a lot of manuscript, and people don't believe this, but I can usually tell very often with one sentence, usually a paragraph, certainly after 2 or 3 paragraphs, absolutely. The first page, I can tell you whether the book's a going concern or not. Or no, that's not fair. Whether the writer of the book is worth reading or not. I think,
working with.
Or working with, or even considering reading on and seeing further. And you can change your mind if the thing gets slacker, or but generally speaking, you can see and sense that within a very short piece of writing. Cyril Connolly, said that you could taste a vintage by a sip. That you don't need to drink the whole bottle to decide whether it's good wine or not. F.R. Leavis, a much maligned man, said there is no such thing as the meaning of a poem. What there always is, and the same applies to prose, the poem is merely black marks on a page. The job of the reader is to recreate the black marks on the page, which means that the act of reading, which you were asking about a moment or two ago, is a recreation of something that somebody has put down. It's almost like a score, which you can follow.
And it's your interpretation of that score.
Yeah, well,
the reader interprets the score.
To an extent.
The music I hear is going to be different than your music. It has to be. We're different.
But not in that we are different sensibilities and different minds and et cetera, et cetera. But, the marks on the page do have fixed meanings.
But one of the joys of my life over the decades has been, it's exactly what you're talking about, reading Shakespeare and taking hours over each scene, debating with friends what that word means.
Yeah. Yes, this is true, but there are parameters to it. If I see blue and you see red,
it's a problem.
This is not true. This is, one of us is wrong.
I think you see red a lot more than I do.
could be.
Just talking then about editing, and this is from the book Temerity and Gall, and this idea of how you determine if something is good. You say innovative shapes must be forged in language that is precise and quick to the touch, like touching skin. So you mean the feeling you get? Is that it?
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yes.
I said, must be like touching skin or the fur of an animal, that there is something so electric and sensual about touching skin or an animal's, say, a dog's coat or something like that, that is unlike any other sensation that's known to us.
Okay.
And it's, you are being put in touch with life, with the concentrated power that somebody has poured into those words, and you are suddenly plugged into their electricity, and that is how you can tell good writing from bad. And squadrons of academics will say to me, well, that's very fanciful nonsense, and etc., etc.
And you're putting your money on the line, or Dan Wells, or whomever it might be. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like having the memory of licking your finger and sticking it in an electric socket.
Yeah.
I mean, you know it's happened, and I think 99% of academics have never experienced it.
Okay. Tell me about then taking the jump or moving to Oberon Press.
Ah, yeah. Well, I'd written a novel called Going Down Slow, which M&S published.
Mm-hmm.
I found out, actually, this is a very interesting little story. I found out, actually, just the other day, I mean, literally, that my move to M&S had been engineered by Mordecai Richler. I'd met Mordecai in Montreal at some bean fest at the Ritz Hotel for, I don't know who was there, Weaver or something was there, and Richler and some other people. And I was talking to him and everything, and I saw a book that had been written about Weaver, a biography and an account.
Nave, was that?
Yes, Montreal writer, and she reproduced in there a letter that Mordecai had sent following meeting me at this binge at the Ritz, saying that I think that you should publish this guy and get him free from, Clark Irwin. And
Clark Irwin would have been...
They were the ones who did the 2 volumes of New Canadian Writing, 67 and 8 or something, and Clark Blaze was in the first one and I was in the second one.
Okay.
And they were those were put together by the chap that wrote The Perilous Trade.
Oh yes, McSkimming.
Yes, Roy McSkimming. He was working at Clark Irwin as a student, summer job as a student doing something or other. He said, these very good short story writers, we should do these 2 books. So he started my career in,
Okay. So you went to McClellan Stewart.
Yeah.
And then what?
Well...
Because that was brief, right?
Yes, yeah. I only stayed there for the year that book was out, because I felt that I was just being treated by them very offhandedly.
You mean what? They weren't paying attention to you?
No, there was no, and there was no publicity. There was,
which is unusual, because that's what he's known for.
Well, you see, I interpreted that as being really that, or something I realised later, that Jack McClelland was really only comfortable with the people, of round about his own age or people he himself had found, and he put all his interest there. So I was dealing with Anna Zagathi then, now Porter, and she was pleasant and everything, but I really only had any contact with or whatsoever during the actual sort of lead up to the publication of the book and that kind of thing. And then heard nothing from them for a year. And I thought, this is, I'm not in a commercial, I don't want a commercial situation. No. I want a situation where there's somebody interested in what I'm doing and understands it and, and would promote it and everything. And I thought, well, the answer is Oberon. At the time, it seemed to me, to be the place. Yeah, so I moved over there and published there for a while.
Okay, this is how you describe the person that ran it, Macklim.
Macklim. Michael Macklim, yeah.
Yeah, and you describe him as he was ungrateful, blindly autocratic, tirelessly arrogant, grossly insulting, while seemingly unaware of being so, and hampered in his literary and nationalistic aspirations by an undeveloped literary taste and strange loyalties to unlikely writers on his list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very harsh judgment to make, but he was an impossible person.
How many books did you do with him?
I think 2, as far as I can recall, 2 short story collections. Yeah. But I edited for the press later. No, I did Best Canadian Stories.
Because they had that franchise, or?
It had been started by David Helwig, in
Kingston?
He was in Kingston at the time, yeah. So after 2 or 3 years of editing that anthology, which actually became very important, Dan Wells and I took over the franchise when Oberon went out of business, and we're bringing out Best Canadian Stories now. And next year we're bringing out 50 years anthology of the best stories from. I was
going to say, it's like the booker of the booker, the best of the best, I guess, right?
Yeah, theoretically speaking, yeah. I edited it with Clark Blaze.
For Oberon back then?
For Oberon, yeah.
Okay.
And also following him with Leon Rook.
So that's when you sort of forged your friendships.
Yeah. And I'd got Leon published there. His first book in Canada I took too.
Because he's American, right? Or was?
Yeah.
Yeah.
His first book came out with Louisiana State University Press. Last One Home Sleeps in the Yellow Bed, it's called. Yeah, and I took a collection there called The Love Parlor to Oberon, and Michael Macklim said to me, well, I'll publish it on your say-so as long as I don't have to read it. And I said, fine. I mean, the arrogance and the...
But I don't know if we want to get into that necessarily.
Well, I mean, it's a very interesting thing because he was seemingly unaware of how offensive he was being to other people. He would say the most awful things, statements that left people who heard them like acutely embarrassed or uncomfortable, and seemingly totally unaware that he had said anything sort of odd, And, so, he was a very difficult man to get along with.
So from there you moved to ECW?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, that was run by 2 friends of mine, Jack David and Robert Lecker.
How were they friends?
I got to know them, over the years. They were both at the time academics, and they were publishing, so what I was publishing and what they were doing sort of vaguely touched, and, as one builds a network of associates and that kind of thing, and friends, and they were busily engaged at first as postgraduate students in putting together ECW magazine, which was all concerned with Canadian writing, and then they published a series of books, Canada's major writers, and
criticism,
criticism, yeah. So I was acutely aware of what they were doing, and I liked both of them, and we got on very well together, and. Yeah, so
It's hard not to get along with Jack. I don't know Robert so well, but
Jack accepted to publish a book I'd written, and I wish now earnestly that I had never written it. It's called General Ludd.
fiction.
Fiction, yeah, a novel, big book, I'm afraid. I would say, looking back on it now, that I'm acutely embarrassed by it, and I wish I'd never written it. And I said, I can remember saying to Robert Lecker when it was sort of in production, you know, if I had any sense, I'd pull this now and not allow it to be published. And
What's so bad about it?
well, it's ill written and it's full of ideas.
Which kind of goes against your...
Which goes against everything that I sort of believe in, really.
Right.
I used to say to my best of my students, you know, when I was teaching high school and in fact teaching, you know, junior college, I used to say to them, if you have an idea, go and have a lie down until it goes away. And so this dreadful book is bulging with ideas.
Oh, great. Look, okay, I don't want to get too sidetracked on the ideas, but what was the best idea coming out of that book?
Oh, I don't think it
Has any good ideas?
No, it was just a mess. It was just a mess.
Okay. So how long were you with ECW for then?
Oh, just for that one
Just
book.
for that book? Okay. And they lost money on it, I guess.
Well,
did they?
yeah, because I'd also said to them at the same time that they ought to take on Hugh Hood and Leon Rourke. So they put us on the road together and, you know, we went from Montreal out to Vancouver with stops all along the way and everything. And it brought them to the brink of ruin financially. And,
oh, dear.
And so, you know, that really didn't work out. And then I moved on, I guess, to Porcupine's Quill at that point.
I see.
Again, wanting to remain with a small press where you know, one had an emotional relationship with people who were printing, publishing, and, you know, that kind of thing.
So how's the emotional relationship with Tim Inkster then?
Well, I mean, it was okay, but I mean, Tim is not somebody who is, what shall I say, very emotionally relaxed. And he would find, I think, intimacy of any kind very uncomfortable. And, you know, so he always sort of...
Sounds like your father.
Bit distant, yeah. Right. But I worked for Tim for, I think, 17 years.
Oh, my goodness.
I edited over, I think, about 250 books during that period of time for Porcupine's Quill. Wow. The thing was that Tim is a very fine craftsman, and what he was really interested in was the printing.
Yeah.
And he loves paper and he loves press, and he actually, in the basement of his house where the press was headquartered, he had a Cord Heidelberg press in the basement on which he printed all this stuff.
So on the face of it, sounds like a good fit. You do the editorial, he does the printing.
Well, yeah, the interesting thing was that after about working there for about 2 years, during which he was like sort of extra guarded, he relaxed a little bit in around about the third year, and he sort of more or less used to say to me, "What are we publishing this year?" So I had more or less total editorial control of what went on there, which in one way was good because I could do what I wanted, and in another way was not so good because it gave me the leeway to make some choices that I shouldn't have made.
Mistakes.
Well, books that were all right, but they weren't up there where I was really thinking, you know, and my big mistake, and of course this was helped by the fact that there was nobody saying to me, "Really? You want to publish this?"
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
There was
Second opinion.
There was nobody to quarrel with me, and I gave way to kindness, you know, which is always a mistake in publishing.
Yeah, because everyone wants to get published, and if you're able to say, yes, we're going to publish your book, what a thrill for them.
Yeah. The peaks of publishing, I mean, were so distant and immense, like Alice Munro and Mavis Gallant and Mordecai and et cetera, et cetera.
What do you mean the peaks were so distant? What do you mean?
They were so huge and so unapproachable. I mean, for the average run of writers.
Their success, you mean?
Their ability.
Oh, their ability.
Right. That success is irrelevant. I mean, for example, Mordecai was very successful financially. Today, he isn't taught, I'm told, in a single university in Canada. Gone. So, I mean, what happened to me there, basically, was, although I did some tremendously important and terrific books there, actually.
Like what?
I published all of Clark Blaze. 4 volumes, 5 volumes.
There was an article recently in the basically saying this is the man.
Yeah. I published Clark. I published Leon. I published Caroline Addison. It goes on and on.
Well, that's the thing, though. The thing is, though, 90% of it, everything is. Well, you know what I mean? That's what publishing is.
That's exactly true. Yeah. But I mean, the big fault that I made there was that this kindness, leads to sloppiness, really.
Yeah.
And I mistook.
Well, plus, was it your money on the line?
No.
There we go.
But I mistook foothills for mountains, which is the mistake that kindness leads you towards. And I no longer have that kindness. And so the editing that I'm doing for Biblioasis, where I'm just coming up to 18 years of publishing with him, with Dan,
wow.
I'm not making that mistake, I don't think.
Okay, so just see that there's another quote about Imagism. I just want to go back to that. All your life has been a constant conversation with Imagism. And the assemblage instructions: remove similes, compress, replace adjectives and adverbs with an accurate verb, imply, don't explain, understand silences, employ white space, embrace your dictionary. Elegance does not lie in elegant variation. Make the reader work. So we've pretty well covered that, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
The business about making the reader work, I mean, is essential though in understanding what lies behind all the editing that I do. That if you look at a conventional writer who is successful in terms of sales and that kind of thing, you will find that in nearly every sentence there is something that tells the reader how to respond to the line that's been written, like...
how is that? Give me an example of that.
Well, he sat down gingerly. She smiled graciously, or, etc. There's always a word in there somewhere undermining the sentence, in that it's spoon-feeding the meaning of the sentence to the reader.
So you really need to pay attention to those words as a reader, obviously.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I put it this way. This is something I'm very fond of saying to people, and a lot of them don't understand what I'm talking about. I always say to the writers that I'm working with, stop explaining things to people.
Yeah.
Make the reader work at understanding, because if you make the reader work, you're writing better and tighter and harder, but you're also giving the reader a job to do. And I said, good readers, I always say this, and I absolutely believe this, good readers will stop reading if your writing is sloppy, because they want to work. They are like sheepdogs. And if you don't allow sheepdogs to round things up into
let's
no, just listen.
Okay.
If you don't allow the sheepdog to circle and round up the sheep to a smaller and smaller and smaller circle, they mope and they're unhappy.
Okay, well,
but that's exactly the reason why you must engage the reader in activities that exercises their imagination.
right. I wouldn't demean the reader quite like that and call them a sheep. I'd call them like a movie director. Director.
I'm not demeaning them by comparing them. I love sheepdog.
Okay. And they're intelligent.
Of course,
yes,
very.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, that's why they get bored with reading things that doesn't challenge them to do their job.
Yes. Okay.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So along these lines, one of my favorite short stories ever is Chekhov's The Kiss.
Mm-hmm.
And in that story, as you probably recall, the main character goes to a dinner party and gets up from the table and somehow gets into this dark room, and a woman kisses him. He doesn't even see her. And if you read the passage very closely, you're not even sure if he's actually kissed. But what happened with that story, the more I thought about it, is the way that he reacted to that kiss was felt wonderful. He basically went through a passionate love affair in his mind just because of that maybe kiss. These actions that were described opened up the whole reality of what it's like to fall in love passionately. What your mind does, it races forward. It hopes. It's quite extraordinary, but it relates to exactly what you're saying, which is all the work that I'm doing and enjoying doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Chekhov was really the sort of imagist. I mean, he's the beginning of it all, you know. I mean, when Norman Levine died, a great Canadian short story writer, I wrote an obituary for one of the UK papers, and I said, if he believed in anything, it was probably Chekhov. You know, and I was trying to say, you know, he didn't believe in nation or race or, you know, any of those huge abstractions. It was the work in the short story form of Chekhov. Yeah, and I mean, it comes down from Chekhov into Imagism, and I mean the whole group of stuff is related. But lots of people would go straight back to Chekhov and say, yes, this is where it starts, before Pound. Yes, because Pound didn't get at it till a little bit later, but and from a different angle. But yeah, it's the essential nature of the reader to the writer. And I mean, when you think of, I don't know, the sort of book that I might look at late at night when I'm tired and I want to read a few pages before I fall asleep, you know, I might read something by David Balducci or something, which is like taking warm milk with opium in it. I mean, you know, it's so drivelly, you know, that you just fall asleep. No, I mean, the difficulty is inherent in the whole modernist position on the part of the reader. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a challenge. So, I mean, when people say, well, if you're so good, how come you aren't rich? I mean, the answer is that the number of people who want to put in the hard work of reading and understanding is very small.
That's the thing. Well, and you make the point throughout the book. You quote John Meisel talking about this sort of limited audience.
The thinness of a cultural class in Canada.
Yeah, and you've spent a lot of energy over the years kind of bemoaning and getting angry about that. The problem is we don't have that big a population. It's just, I don't know why you get so upset about it. It's just, that's the way it is. So, I mean, why do you get so upset about it?
Well, I mean, what we're talking about here is, let's say, and I'm being generous, in these figures, that a well-reviewed collection of short stories in this country, and I mean a really well-reviewed one, is lucky to sell 500 copies. Out of a population of, what are we now, 40-something, 42 million or something like that. It means, like, you know, we have so few readers in this country that we cannot talk about a national literature. It's ridiculous. You can't have a national literature with 300 readers, you know, because you're just edging into fantasy land. And the reason why I get angry about it, I mean, it's not that I am criticizing the readers. It's those people who ought to be at the top of Canadian society in terms of intelligence, education, upbringing, sheer luck in what they grow up to be. There must be more than 500. The academics, I mean, they're a farce.
But you get there. This sounds angry.
Yeah, but I am angry about it.
But what can you do about it? Get angry?
Yeah, one thing I can do about it.
Your heart hurts.
But listen. If you put all the people who teach Canadian literature or literature of any kind, you know, there are very few of them left as far as I can see. If you put together every English department in the country, in every university, in every college, you'd be hard-pressed to find one with any real understanding of what literature's about. They'll tell you all about various political movements. They'll tell you about all kinds of nonsensical, you know, things about, you know, race and sexual preferences and, you know, and et cetera, et cetera. Harold Bloom pinned it down beautifully when he said that, you know, we are living in a period of time when universities are more interested in Victorian women's underwear than they are in Charles Dickens or Robert Browning. And I mean, this is true. And yes, that is appalling.
Okay, well, let's get back to fine writing. Here's what you say. Fine writing should make us abnormally receptive to the verbal world so that the verbal world can return to us the real world more intensely seen and felt. That is what great poetry does to us. Fine prose, too, should strip us bare. And then you go on to say, the point I'm asserting is that fine writing demands that we open ourselves to it, demands of us a naked, passionate response. That simple thought underlines everything that this meandering book is suggesting. So, what is a naked, passionate response?
Well, it's one where you are emotionally devastated by what you are reading. It's really very simple.
This is what you want in a book?
Oh, yeah.
This is your selection criteria. This is how you acquire books.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I quote in that book somewhere the wonderful comments of a Scottish writer who, you know, was talking about the short story and said the short story is small in the way that a bullet is small. You know, it should strike you and knock your fucking head off is what she wrote. And that's exactly it. The point that I'm trying to make is that you are not in a fit state to distinguish between a good book and a great book or a bad book and a good book and subtle variations within, unless you have at some point in your life experienced reading something that emotionally destroys you, something that is so fantastic that its emotional impact on you is so great that, you know, you give up. You say, that is a vision that, you know, is so emotionally important. And it's those kinds of experiences, probably we only have it, 2 or 3 times in a lifetime, if that, by which we must judge everything else.
Yeah.
So if somebody says, let's take a writer that I have a very high opinion of, Mordecai Richler, and compare Mordecai's, say, St. Urban's Horseman, which I happen to think is his best book, but...
won the Governor General's Award.
Oh, well. But if you compare that with, I don't know, books that have, or literary experiences anyway, if not books, but, that have had that same kind of impact on me, would be Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy is a book that just, destroys you. I mean, it's just a monstrous book.
Yeah, it's funny. The word destroy,
I mean by destroy, it knocks down all your defenses, all your quibbles, all your yes buts. It's a thing that it's like being hit by a Mack truck.
It is kind of a passionate, it's like passionate love. In a way, it's like that powerful.
It is.
If you do meet the right book.
It is passionate love. That's what
I like that better than destroyed. Okay, so
something else that did that to me, for example.
Yeah.
I'll give you 2 examples from the theatre. I mean, you can go to the theatre lots of times and be, engaged, entranced, titivated, whatever. I remember when I was still at Bristol University, and so this would have been within 4 years of the first publication and performance of Waiting for Godot, a group of students at Bristol, one of whom was French, and therefore sort of au fait with what was going on in Paris, which the rest of us, of course, being ignorant Englishmen, weren't. He came back with Waiting for Godot, and a group of students put it on at Bristol University, and I went along, thinking, oh, well, it's some play. I knew nothing about it or anything about Beckett at the time either. Never heard of him. And I sat there, and this thing unfolded, and it just changed my life. I was wiped out. I mean, I just, and is it the words? I don't know. Maybe it was the silences when nobody was saying anything at all.
The devastation.
Yes, I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. The other theatrical experience that I've had of similar impact was many, many years ago when I was still in school, grammar school, high school. I went up to London to the West End to see production of Hamlet with Paul Schofield, Paul Schofield playing Hamlet. And it was the same thing. He was indescribably fine. The idea of being in a theatre or people near you or next to you in seats just fell away, and you were just riveted on the stage in those words of the soliloquies and everything. They were just extraordinary. That, oddly enough, this is a piece of Canadian arcana that not many people could connect with. But John Mills had been over here in Canada at the Stratford Festival, and he had picked up Tiff Finlay, and he took him back to London, and Tiff Finlay was in that production of Paul Schofield, and he was playing Osric, which is, I think, as I recall, a non-speaking role, but he doffed his cap and made a knee and bowed and, and et cetera, and generally farted about, and I said to him many years later, we were sitting in a bar somewhere having a drink, and I said, when I was 17, I saw you in Schofield's Hamlet, and he said, please don't speak of it.
It's like your ECW novel.
Right, for him, yeah. But
that's lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're at Quill.
Yeah.
Anything you want to add on that?
Well, I did some very fine poetry collections there. as well that I was pleased with and remained pleased with. Richard Outram, John Newlove, George Johnson, of course, and Don Coles. I did some good short story collections there too. Yeah, and the end of that was very strange, and I still haven't got my mind around it actually, because I don't know if you remember any of this, but there was a time when Stoppard Publishing, General Publishing, Stoddart, yes, sorry, he was distributing for a lot of small press publishers, and so he had vast amounts of their stock in his warehouses, and then he went bankrupt, and the contents of the warehouses and everything were frozen, and the rights were held, and publishers couldn't sell their books or anything because they were frozen. They couldn't get the books out to sell or anything. So it was all terribly unfortunate. The end result of this was that Tim decided that he was finished, that he got so much money out in copies of books and everything that were all in Stoddart's warehouse that he just couldn't go on. So he declared, he wrote an article actually that was published in the Globe and Mail saying that he was finished as a publisher. And he phoned me and he said, not untypically, well, I'm done, I can't go on, there's no money, it's all collapsed, there's nothing for you to do anymore, so that's it. Didn't say thank you for the previous 18 years, but so I then, I forget what book I'd fairly recently published, something or other. Anyway, Dan Wells at that time was not a publisher. He owned a used bookstore in Windsor. He was organising a literary festival in Windsor, and he was inviting various people to come down and read and perform and things at this festival. And he invited me to read, and he shows you what a fine person he is. That he said of everybody that he'd invited, he made a point of reading, a book of theirs to, so that he could make polite and informed conversation. I mean, which most organisers of festivals do not do. So what he read was a book that I'd done with Thomas Allen for Patrick Crean, who was editing there at the time, called An Aesthetic Underground, which was a sort of autobiography. And
it's like an orange cover?
That's right, yeah. So anyway, he'd read that the night before I was to appear in Windsor, and it had apparently destroyed him.
You're using his word? Is that his word?
No, it's mine.
No, okay.
He was so engaged with this book that anyway, I sort of, I went on and performed.
Performed is the word that we actually brought up in our previous interview about writing.
Well, it's performing, yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
So anyway, after I'd been reading that night, he said, shall we go out for a drink? And I said, yeah, sure. And we went out and drank far too much scotch, and we're talking and talking and talking and talking. And I was very attracted to Dan. I thought that he was a really, really interesting and nice person, and what he knew surprised me. So he said to me at some point, I'd been in his bookstore that previous afternoon, and I knew he was pretty serious because he had some books in there that surprised me as well. I mean, very, recherche and pretty good stuff, and I'd cast my eye over all this and was already forming opinions. So he said to me, I think what I really would like to do, I think I would like to become a publisher, possibly in our cups by this time. I said to him, well, I'll help you. And I said, the problem is that you can't get writers with reputations to give you books to an unknown person who's just starting a press out. It doesn't even exist at this point. Yeah. I said, you know, no writer of any quality is going to deal with you at all. I said, and the only way that you can get going is if I get hold of some people with reputations and get a single short story from them, and then you can publish that as a separate short story, you know, bind it up nicely and you know, nice covers and stuff, and put them out as like pamphlets, basically, you know.
Yeah.
And I said, and then you will have all these names behind you that you can then approach somebody and say, you know, do you want to send us your manuscript, kind of thing? Look at who we've published before. So this is the sort of plan I laid out to him, and I said to him, you know, probably boastfully, but accurately as it turned out, I said, I can make you into the best small press in Canada. And he was sort of silent, and he looked down and away from me and sort of down at the table. And then he said, I don't want to be the best small press in Canada. And I said, well, what do you want? And he said, I want to be Andre Deutsch. And I thought, oh boy, have I connected into what I want.
He's got ambition.
Well, his view wasn't piddling around in Canada. It was to take in the best from the world that he could get, as all big publishers do, you know. Yeah. And he has done this with incredible success. And also, I mean, we became and remain very close friends, you know, so. And I'm still full of admiration for him.
Yes. Well, you say in the book that you love him.
Yes, I do.
I don't know about incredible success in Canada. In fact, I think it's very difficult for a publisher with any big ambition to, if they want to service the Canadian market, to be hugely successful. He's been commenting on that lately.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, this is the same question over again. He can service that part of the Canadian population which is capable of reading the books that he's putting out.
Yes, and what's stopping him from being a worldwide publisher? Is there anything stopping him?
The lack of interest in England and the United States in the books that he's publishing, although the books that he's publishing from Europe sell in the United States largely, and Canadian books, of course, don't. But the books that he does in translation and everything are selling incredibly well in the United States. They're very, very interested.
For example?
Well, the translations of Roy Jacobson and we did Duck's Newburyport.
Yeah. That's an interesting story.
Oh, indeed it is. And I mean, for example, he sold 45,000 copies of that book.
And that's a big, challenging book.
That's a book that every major publisher in the United States and Canada rejected. And we did it.
That's the thing. I think at one point you say in your book that you talk about the reason that you wrote this book. I like the back and forth, incidentally, in Temerity and Gall between you and Dan. There's some nice, there's a fair amount of mutual backslapping, but it's also interesting and enjoyable.
Yeah.
But there's a point where he says something like, you don't have anything to prove. And this is what's interesting to me about your career is you've put your imprint on Canadian writing in a big way, and you've got hundreds of books to prove it. They're not going to go anywhere. Unless they go in the dumpster, they're going to stick around. You've achieved. And this is what he says. And then you say, if I felt like I'd done that, I wouldn't have spent 16 bloody months on this book.
Yeah.
I can't help but think the way that Dan does.
Well, I mean, what I'm saying is that, after 50 years, a book of mine will sell 500 copies. So I always come back to John Meissel's. He ascribes all the woes of Canadian culture to the lack of a.
It's just we just don't have the population. And part of that is there's all sorts of reasons for that.
Yeah,
and all sorts of some ugly reasons.
Yeah, but whatever the reasons, it is so.
It is so, but okay, you did the best you could.
So what are you arguing about?
Well, I'm not. I'm just saying. I'm saying you feel like you haven't done a good job or something. And what I'm saying, along with him, is, Jesus, you've published more than 200 books. Come on.
But to what reception is the question?
Well, listen, anyone who does anything like I'm doing and like you have to accept that most people don't give a shit. You just accept that and do the best you can do.
Yes, well,
and then you die.
That's all I've been doing.
Well, and you've been doing it admirably, and thank you for talking to me about it.
A great pleasure.
John Metcalf, without an E, is the senior fiction editor at Biblioasis and lives in Ottawa with his wife, Myrna, who's been very quiet and respectful is the word. Thank you so much. Thanks again.
A pleasure.